The autumn wind carried whispers of scandal through Cedar Falls as Isabel Martinez stepped off the dusty stagecoach, her worn leather satchel clutched tightly in trembling hands. The year was 1887, and the Colorado Territory settlement buzzed with the kind of cruel gossip that could destroy a woman's reputation before she even had a chance to build one. What the townspeople didn't know was that the young woman they were about to reject would soon reveal truths about courage and heritage that would shake their carefully constructed prejudices to the very foundation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabel's dark eyes surveyed the settlement of Cedar Falls with a mixture of hope and apprehension as the stagecoach driver roughly deposited her single trunk onto the wooden boardwalk. The town stretched before her, like something from the dime. Novels she'd read back in California, all weathered storefronts and promise of new beginnings. Main Street bustled with afternoon activity as merchants hawked their wares, and children chased each other between the horses and wagons that kicked up clouds of red dust in the crisp October air. She had traveled nearly 800 miles to reach this place, responding to a carefully worded advertisement in the San Francisco Chronicle that had promised a respectable marriage to a God-fearing rancher seeking a devoted wife. The letters that had followed over 3 months had painted pictures of a stable life, a comfortable home, and the kind of acceptance that had always eluded her in the diverse but often unforgiving communities of her childhood. Samuel Carter had written of his prosperous cattle operation, his standing in the community, and his desire for a woman who could help him build a legacy in the growing territory. What Samuel Carter had not mentioned in his flowing script was that Cedar Falls, Colorado, was the kind of place where a woman's bloodline mattered more than her character, where the color of her skin could determine her worth before she ever spoke a word. Isabel had learned early in life that her mixed Spanish and Pueblo Indian heritage made her an outsider in most respectable circles. But she had hoped that the frontier might offer different opportunities than the rigid social structures she'd known in California. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed through the heavy wooden door, seeking directions to the Carter Ranch and perhaps a moment to collect herself before the meeting that would determine her future. The interior smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the lingering sweetness of peppermint sticks displayed in large glass jars. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that immediately narrowed upon seeing Isabel's olive complexion and distinctly non-European features. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone suggesting that helping was the last thing she intended to do. Her gaze traveled deliberately from Isabel's carefully mended traveling dress to her worn but polished boots, cataloguing every detail that marked her as someone from away, someone different. "I'm looking for directions to the Carter Ranch," Isabel replied, straightening her shoulders and meeting the woman's stare directly. Years of facing similar scrutiny had taught her that confidence, even when she didn't feel it, was often her best defense against immediate dismissal. "I'm expected there this afternoon." The woman's eyebrows rose dramatically, and she leaned forward across the counter as if sharing a confidence. "You wouldn't happen to be that mail-order bride Sam Carter's been expecting, would you?" The question carried undertones of disbelief and something approaching scandalized amusement. "I am Isabel Martinez, yes. Mr. Carter and I have been corresponding for several months regarding marriage." Isabel kept her voice steady, despite the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong with this entire arrangement. The woman's reaction suggested that her arrival was neither secret nor welcome news to the local population. "Well, I'll be," the shopkeeper muttered, then raised her voice to carry to the other customers browsing the store's merchandise. "Rebecca Thomas, come see this. It's Carter's mail-order bride, the one he's been telling everyone about." The way she emphasized the words made them sound like an accusation rather than a simple statement of fact. Two other customers materialized from behind a display of farming implements, their faces bright with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for traveling circuses or public scandals. Rebecca Thompson, a blonde woman in an expensive blue dress that spoke of Eastern refinement, looked Isabel up and down with unconcealed disappointment. Thomas Reed, a tall man with a carefully groomed mustache and the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, shook his head slowly, as if witnessing a particularly tragic mistake. "My word," Rebecca breathed, pressing a gloved hand to her chest in theatrical dismay. "Samuel certainly didn't mention that his intended was, well, that she looked so—" She seemed to struggle for words that would express her shock without being openly insulting. "Indian," Thomas supplied bluntly, his voice carrying across the store with the authority of someone used to speaking uncomfortable truths. "Or at least, in part Indian. Look at those cheekbones, that skin tone. I'd say she's got quite a bit of savage blood running through her veins." Isabel felt heat rise in her cheeks, but years of similar encounters had taught her that reacting with anger would only confirm their worst assumptions about her temperament and breeding. Instead, she maintained her composure and addressed the shopkeeper directly. "The directions to the Carter Ranch, please. I don't wish to keep Mr. Carter waiting." The woman behind the counter exchanged meaningful glances with her customers before responding. "Oh, honey, I'm afraid you might be in for quite a surprise when you get out there. See, Sam Carter's been telling folks around here that he was importing a proper lady from California, someone who could help him rise in society and maybe start a political career. A woman with breeding and connections, if you understand my meaning." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Isabel understood perfectly what the woman meant, just as she understood that her arrival in Cedar Falls was about to become a very public disappointment for Samuel Carter and a source of entertainment for the rest of the community. "I see," Isabel said quietly, though she was beginning to see far more than she had bargained for. "Nevertheless, I've traveled a long way to honor my commitment, and I believe Mr. Carter deserves to meet me as planned." Thomas Reed laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the store's tin ceiling. "Oh, he'll meet you all right. Question is whether he'll acknowledge you once he gets a good look at what he's purchased." The casual cruelty of his words made Isabel's stomach clench, but she forced herself to remain standing straight and dignified. "The Carter place is about 5 miles north of town," the shopkeeper finally provided, her tone suggesting she was doing Isabel a kindness by helping her reach what would surely be a humiliating rejection. "Follow the main road past the church, and keep going until you see the wooden sign with a C burned into it." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Can't miss it." Isabel thanked them politely and made her way back to the street, where the stagecoach driver was preparing to depart. She arranged for her trunk to be delivered to the Carter Ranch, then set off on foot through the growing afternoon. Shadows, her mind racing with new understanding of exactly what kind of situation she had walked into. The road north of Cedar Falls wound through rolling hills covered in golden aspen trees and dark stands of pine that stretched towards snow-capped peaks in the distance. Under different circumstances, Isabel might have appreciated the stark beauty of the Colorado landscape, so different from the Mediterranean climate of her California childhood. Instead, she found herself rehearsing conversations and preparing for confrontations that seemed increasingly inevitable with each step toward the Carter Ranch. She had grown up as the daughter of Miguel Martinez, a Spanish rancher whose family had owned land in California since before it became part of the United States, and Running Deer, a Pueblo woman whose people had been pushed from their traditional territories by the relentless expansion of white settlement. Their marriage had been a love match that scandalized both communities, creating a family that belonged fully to neither world and was often welcomed by none. Isabel had learned early that her mixed heritage made her an object of curiosity and suspicion wherever she went. Too Indian for the Spanish families, too Spanish for the white Americans, and too connected to European culture for the tribal communities her mother's people had been forced to join, she had spent her childhood navigating the complex social hierarchies that determined worth and belonging in the changing West. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving behind debts that forced the sale of the family ranch and scattered what remained of their small community. Her mother had returned to her people, but Isabel had found herself caught between worlds once again, too accustomed to ranch life to be comfortable in the pueblo, too obviously mixed blood to find easy acceptance in the growing cities of California. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like an answer to years of searching for a place where she might belong. Samuel Carter's letters had spoken of building something new in the Colorado Territory, of creating a life based on hard work and mutual respect rather than ancient prejudices and social hierarchies. His words had painted pictures of a partnership that would value character over bloodline, competence over connections. Now, walking the dusty road toward what might be another rejection, Isabel realized she had been naive to hope that the frontier would be any different from the established communities she'd known. If anything, the isolation and struggle of frontier life seemed to make people more suspicious of outsiders, more protective of their small circles of acceptance. The Carter Ranch announced itself with a substantial wooden gate bearing the promised "C" brand, and beyond it lay a cluster of well-maintained buildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. The main house was a solid two-story structure with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Outbuildings included a large barn, several smaller structures that probably housed equipment and supplies, and corrals, where horses moved with the lazy contentment of well-cared-for animals. Isabel paused at the gate, gathering her courage for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. Through the windows of the main house, she could see movement that suggested someone was home. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the gravel drive and knocked firmly on the front door. Samuel Carter answered almost immediately, as if he had been watching for her arrival. He was a man in his early 30s with sandy brown hair, pale blue eyes, and the kind of soft handsomeness that spoke of good living rather than hard labor. His clothes were well-tailored and clean, marking him as someone whose ranch work was more supervisory than physical. When he saw Isabel standing on his porch, his expression shifted from anticipation to confusion to something approaching horror. "You're not," he began, then stopped himself and tried again. "I mean, you must be Miss Martinez from California?" His voice carried the hope that somehow he was mistaken, that the woman he had been expecting would still arrive to replace this obvious error. "I am Isabel Martinez, yes. We've been corresponding about marriage for the past 3 months. Isabel kept her voice steady and professional, as if she were conducting business rather than offering herself for inspection like livestock at a market. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for evaluating breeding stock. She could see him mentally comparing her to whatever image he had constructed from their correspondence, finding her wanting in ways that had nothing to do with her character or capabilities. "I see," he said finally, though his tone suggested he saw far more than he had bargained for. "Perhaps you should come inside so we can discuss this situation privately." The interior of the Carter house reflected the same prosperity evident in the exterior buildings, with heavy furniture, expensive carpets, and the kind of decorative objects that spoke of Eastern connections and social aspirations. Samuel led her into a parlor dominated by a massive stone fireplace and gestured toward a chair upholstered in deep blue velvet. Miss Martinez, he began, settling into a chair across from her and leaning forward with the air of someone about to deliver. Unfortunate news. I'm afraid there's been some sort of misunderstanding about our arrangement. Isabel had been expecting this conversation since her encounter at the general store, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. What sort of misunderstanding, Mr. Carter? I followed your instructions exactly, traveled nearly 800 miles, and am prepared to honor every commitment we discussed in our correspondence. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to find words that would express his rejection without making him appear to be the villain in the situation. The thing is, when I placed that advertisement and we began corresponding, I was under the impression that you were, well, that you came from a different sort of background. What sort of background did you imagine I came from? Isabel asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. She had learned that sometimes forcing people to speak their prejudices aloud was the only way to make them confront the ugliness of their assumptions. I assumed you were of European descent, Samuel said bluntly, abandoning his attempts at diplomacy. Spanish, perhaps, given your surname, but still fundamentally white. I never imagined that you might have Indian blood. The casual way he spoke the words, as if her heritage were a deformity or disease, made Isabel's hands clench in her lap. I never concealed my background from you, Mr. Carter. In fact, I specifically mentioned that my mother's people were Pueblo, and that I had grown up understanding both Spanish and native traditions. Samuel waved a hand dismissively. I thought you were referring to servants or neighbors, not immediate family members. Surely you can understand that this changes everything about our arrangement. No, Isabel said quietly, I cannot understand that at all. What exactly does it change? I can still cook, clean, manage a household, assist with ranch operations, and provide companionship. My heritage doesn't affect any of the practical aspects of marriage that we discussed in our letters. But it affects everything else, Samuel protested, rising from his chair and beginning to pace the length of the parlor. My standing in the community, my business relationships, my political aspirations. Cedar Falls is a respectable town with respectable families. I can't possibly marry someone with savage blood and expect to maintain my reputation. The word savage hung in the air between them like a slap. Isabel had heard it countless times throughout her life, but it never failed to sting with its casual dehumanization of entire peoples and cultures. She remained seated, keeping her voice level, despite the anger building in her chest. I see. So the issue isn't my character, my capabilities, or my commitment to the arrangement we made. The issue is that my heritage might embarrass you in front of your friends and business associates. Samuel stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. Exactly. I'm glad you understand the situation so clearly. This isn't personal, you understand. I'm sure you're a perfectly fine woman in your own way, but marriage is about more than personal compatibility. It's about social advancement, business connections, building a legacy that will be respected for generations. Isabel stood slowly, gathering her dignity around her like armor. Mr. Carter, thank you for clarifying your position so thoroughly. It saves us both from any further misunderstanding about the kind of man you are or the kind of marriage you're seeking. Something in her tone seemed to penetrate Samuel's self-absorption, and he frowned as if suddenly realizing that she might not be as devastated by his rejection as he had expected. Now see here, Miss Martinez, there's no need to take that attitude. I'm prepared to be generous about this situation. I'll pay for your return passage to California and provide enough additional funds to compensate you for your trouble and inconvenience. The offer was meant to be magnanimous, a gesture that would allow him to feel virtuous about his rejection while ensuring that the problem of her presence disappeared quickly and quietly. Isabel looked at him for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the weak, shallow man behind the carefully constructed facade of respectability. "That's very generous, Mr. Carter, but I won't be needing your charity. I'll make my own arrangements for lodging and transportation." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to face him. "I do hope you find the kind of wife you're looking for, someone whose bloodline is pure enough to satisfy your social ambitions." Samuel's face flushed at the obvious sarcasm. In her voice, "You're making a mistake, Miss Martinez. This is a small community, and word travels fast. Once people know about your background, you'll find it very difficult to secure any kind of respectable employment or accommodation. You'd be wise to accept my offer and return to wherever you came from." Isabel smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps, but I've faced worse challenges than the disapproval of a small Colorado town. I think I'll stay and see what opportunities present themselves." She left Samuel Carter standing in his expensive parlor, his face a mixture of confusion and growing anger at her refusal to behave like a properly grateful and submissive woman, accepting his generous rejection. Walking back down the gravel drive toward the main road, Isabel felt a strange sense of liberation despite the uncertainty of her situation. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the entire landscape on fire. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle lowing and the faint sound of someone chopping wood, ordinary sounds of ranch life that reminded her of her childhood and the skills she had learned helping her father manage their California property. As she walked back toward Cedar Falls, carrying her satchel and wondering where she would spend the night, Isabel had no way of knowing that her rejection by Samuel Carter was about to set in motion a series of events that would reveal the true character of the people in this small Colorado community. She couldn't have predicted that her arrival would spark conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface of polite society, or that her presence would force everyone around her to examine their own assumptions about worth, belonging, and the meaning of civilization. Most importantly, she had no idea that a few miles away, a half-breed rancher named Jerome Walker was hearing about the arrival and immediate rejection of Samuel Carter's mail-order bride, and that something in the story was stirring both his curiosity and his sympathy in ways that would soon bring their paths together in unexpected ways. The first chapter of Isabel Martinez's life in Cedar Falls was ending with disappointment and uncertainty, but the second chapter was about to begin with possibilities she had never imagined. Sometimes the most important journeys began with the closing of one door and the discovery that somewhere ahead, another door was already beginning to open. The Cedar Falls Hotel stood 3 stories tall on Main Street, its painted sign creaking in the evening breeze as Isabel approached with growing apprehension. The white clapboard building had seen better days, but it represented her only option for lodging, now that Samuel Carter's rejection had left her stranded in an unfamiliar town with limited funds and no connections. The hotel's lobby smelled of tobacco smoke and old cooking grease, furnished with worn leather chairs and a reception desk that had been polished smooth by decades of use. Behind the desk sat a thin man in his 60s with suspicious eyes and the kind of permanently sour expression that suggested disappointment had become his natural state. "I'd like a room for the night," Isabel said, approaching the desk with what remained of her confidence after the day's humiliations. "Something simple and affordable." The clerk looked up from his newspaper, his gaze immediately focusing on her features with the same scrutinizing attention she had received all day. His eyes narrowed as he took in her olive complexion, dark hair, and the subtle bone structure that marked her mixed heritage as clearly as if she carried a sign announcing her bloodline. "We might have something," he said slowly, "depending." On your circumstances, you traveling alone, got references, how long you planning to stay? The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to probe for information that would help him decide whether she was the kind of guest his establishment could afford to accommodate. "I'm seeking employment in the area," Isabel replied carefully, unwilling to share the details of her situation with someone who was clearly already inclined to view her with suspicion. "I can pay in advance if that's your concern." The clerk leaned back in his chair, studying her with the thoroughness of someone evaluating a questionable business proposition. "Thing is, miss, we got a reputation to maintain here. Family establishment. Respectable clientele. Can't have just anyone coming and going, disturbing our regular guests." Isabel felt the familiar sting of discrimination wrapped in polite language, the kind of rejection that never quite crossed the line into open hostility, but made its message perfectly clear nonetheless. "I understand you need to be selective. About your guests, I can provide character references from California if necessary." "California references don't mean much out here," the clerk said dismissively. "Besides, word's already getting around town about what happened out at the Carter place this afternoon. Seems you're that mail-order bride Sam was expecting, the one that turned out to be not quite what he ordered." The casual cruelty of his words made Isabel's cheeks burn, but she maintained her composure with effort born from years of practice. "Mr. Carter and I had a misunderstanding about our arrangement. That has nothing to do with my ability to pay for a room or conduct myself appropriately as a guest." "Maybe not," the clerk conceded, "but it does raise questions about your character and your intentions in our community. See, Cedar Falls is a peaceful place where folks mind their own business and don't cause trouble for their neighbors. We like to keep it that way." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated fire. Isabel was being warned that her very presence was viewed as a potential source of disruption, that her mixed heritage and current circumstances marked her as someone who might bring unwanted attention or controversy to their quiet town. "I'm not looking to cause trouble for anyone," Isabel said quietly. "I simply need a place to stay while I determine my next course of action." The clerk drummed his fingers on the desk, clearly debating whether the risk of accommodating her was worth the modest profit a single room would provide. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision that satisfied his business instincts while protecting his social standing. "I can give you a room on the 3rd floor, back of the building. $5 for 3 nights, paid in advance. No visitors, no noise, and you'll take your meals elsewhere. Breakfast stops being served at 7, and the front door gets locked at 10. Miss it, and you'll be sleeping in the street." The terms were harsh and the price inflated, but Isabel was in no position to negotiate. She counted out the money and accepted a tarnished brass key, following the clerk's grudging directions to a narrow staircase that led to the hotel's uppermost floor. The room was small and spartanly furnished, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the alley behind the building. The walls were thin enough that she could hear conversations from neighboring rooms, and the mattress sagged in the middle from years of use, but it was clean and private, and after the day's rejections, even basic shelter felt like a small victory. Isabel sat on the edge of the bed and tried to assess her situation rationally. She had enough money to survive for perhaps 2 weeks if she was extremely careful with her spending. Her trunk was presumably still being delivered to the Carter ranch, which meant she would need to retrieve her belongings somehow, assuming Samuel Carter didn't simply refuse to release them. Most importantly, she needed to find employment quickly, though the day's encounters had made it clear that her heritage would make that search more difficult than she had anticipated. The sound of voices drifting up from the street below drew her to the window, where she could see small groups of people gathered on the boardwalks, their animated conversations carrying the unmistakable energy of gossip being shared and embellished. Even from 3 stories up, she could catch fragments of words that suggested she had already become the subject of considerable speculation and commentary. Never seen anything like it. Sam Carter's face when she showed up. What was he thinking, ordering a bride without knowing? Or Indian blood, clear as day. No telling what kind of trouble. The voices faded as the speakers moved on, but their message was clear. Isabel's arrival and rejection had become public entertainment, a scandal that would be discussed and dissected until the next bit of dramatic news displaced it in the community's attention. She was no longer simply a disappointed woman seeking a fresh start. She had become a symbol of disruption, a reminder of the complex racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface of frontier society. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by sounds from the street and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and likely new rejections. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Isabel rose and prepared herself for what she suspected would be a difficult day of job hunting in a community that had already decided she didn't belong. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter as she made her way down Main Street, noting the way conversations stopped when she passed and the curious stares that followed her progress from storefront to storefront. Her first stop was Henderson's Dry Goods, where she hoped to inquire about employment opportunities that might suit her skills and experience. Martha Henderson was a woman in her 50s with graying brown hair and the kind of practical demeanor that suggested years of hard work and practical problem-solving. Unlike the other merchants Isabel had encountered, Mrs. Henderson's expression remained neutral as she approached the counter, though her eyes showed the same careful assessment that had become familiar. "Good morning," Isabel said politely. "I'm looking for information about employment opportunities in the area. I have experience with bookkeeping, inventory management, and general store operations." Mrs. Henderson studied her thoughtfully, taking in her neat appearance and professional manner. "You're the young lady who came in yesterday asking about the Carter Ranch, aren't you? Isabel Martinez." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Carter and I found that we weren't as compatible as our correspondence had suggested." Isabel kept her voice neutral, unwilling to provide details that might fuel further gossip. "I see." Mrs. Henderson seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "What kind of experience do you have with store work?" Isabel felt a flutter of hope at the question, which suggested at least the possibility of employment consideration rather than immediate dismissal. "I helped manage my father's ranch operation in California, which included maintaining financial records, ordering supplies, and coordinating with various merchants and suppliers. I'm comfortable with numbers and have a good memory for inventory and customer preferences. Those are useful skills," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged. "Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to hire additional help right now. Business has been slow, and my husband and I manage most of the work ourselves. But I can tell you that the other businesses in town aren't likely to have openings either." The gentle rejection was delivered with more kindness than Isabel had received elsewhere, but it still represented another closed door in her search for economic stability. "I understand. Thank you for considering my inquiry." "Miss Martinez," Mrs. Henderson said, as Isabel turned to leave, "might I offer some advice?" Isabel paused, uncertain whether she wanted to hear whatever guidance the older woman felt compelled to share. "Of course." Cedar Falls is a small community with long-established families and strong opinions about who belongs and who doesn't. Your situation with Mr. Carter has created talk, and that talk isn't favorable to your prospects. You might find better opportunities in Denver or one of the larger mining towns, where people are more concerned with what you can do than where you come from. The suggestion was delivered kindly, but it carried the unmistakable message that Isabel's presence was viewed as problematic and her departure would be welcomed. "Thank you for the advice, Mrs. Henderson. I'll certainly consider all my options." Isabel's next stops at the seamstress shop, the bakery, and the small restaurant that served meals to travelers all yielded similar results. Polite inquiries met with carefully worded rejections, suggestions that she might find better opportunities elsewhere, and the growing certainty that her mixed heritage had marked her as unemployable in the respectable businesses of Cedar Falls. By midday, she had exhausted most of the obvious possibilities for employment and was beginning to consider the unpalatable option of accepting Samuel Carter's offer to pay for her return to California. The prospect of retreat felt like admitting defeat, but pride wouldn't pay for food and lodging while she searched for alternatives. It was while walking past the Silver Dollar Saloon that Isabel encountered her first open hostility rather than polite rejection. The establishment was technically closed during daytime hours, but several men had gathered on the covered porch, their conversation loud enough to carry clearly to anyone passing on the street. "There goes Carter's mail-order mistake," one of them called out as she approached. "Wonder if she's looking for a new arrangement now that Sam's seen what he actually bought." Isabel kept walking, her face carefully expressionless, but the men seemed to interpret her silence as invitation to continue their commentary. "Maybe she's not particular about the terms," another voice suggested with a laugh that made her skin crawl. "I hear Indian women are grateful for any attention from white men." "Course, she's only half Indian," a third man added. "Other half might have some standards." The crude laughter that followed made Isabel quicken her pace, but one of the men had apparently decided that ignoring them was unacceptable behavior that required correction. "Hey, señorita," he called, his voice carrying the mock respectful tone that made the address an insult rather than courtesy. "No need to be unfriendly. We're just making conversation." Isabel reached the end of the block and turned the corner, putting the saloon and its patrons out of sight, but the encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit. The casual objectification and racial stereotyping represented a level of hostility that went beyond mere social rejection into something approaching predatory interest. She was so focused on putting distance between herself and the men at the saloon that she almost collided with a horse and rider who had stopped in the middle of the street. The horse was a magnificent bay gelding with intelligent eyes and the kind of careful training that spoke of hours of patient work, and its rider was a man who immediately captured her attention in ways that had nothing to do with avoiding collision. Jerome Walker sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had been riding since childhood, but there was something in his posture and bearing that set him apart from the other men she had encountered in Cedar Falls. His features showed the same mixed heritage that marked her own background, though his combination appeared to be white and Native American rather than Spanish and Pueblo. His dark hair was longer than the fashion favored by most of the town's men, and his clothes were practical working gear rather than the carefully maintained appearances that seemed so important to the local establishment. "Excuse me," Isabel said, stepping back to give the horse proper space. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Jerome studied her with dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "No harm done. You're the lady who came in on yesterday's stage, aren't you? Isabel Martinez?" The use of her name surprised her, though she supposed that in a town the size of Cedar Falls, news of her arrival and rejection would have spread quickly through all social circles. "Yes, I am. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Jerome Walker. I run a spread about 10 miles east of town." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was courteous without being presumptuous. "I heard about your situation with Sam Carter. I'm sorry it didn't work out the way you'd hoped." Isabel was struck by the genuine sympathy in his voice, so different from the curiosity and judgment she had encountered elsewhere. "Thank you. Mr. Carter and I discovered that we had different expectations about the arrangement." Jerome's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I imagine you did. Sam's got some pretty specific ideas about what kind of wife would enhance his standing in the community." The comment carried undertones that suggested Jerome Walker had his own opinions about Samuel Carter's character and priorities, none of them particularly flattering. Isabel found herself curious about this man, who seemed to understand the social dynamics of Cedar Falls from the perspective of someone who existed outside its established hierarchies. "Are you familiar with Mr. Carter's business?" she asked, partly from genuine curiosity, and partly because talking to someone who didn't seem inclined to judge or dismiss her was a welcome relief from the day's other encounters. "We've had some dealings over the years. Boundary disputes, water rights, the usual neighbor disagreements that come up when people are trying to build something in country that doesn't always cooperate with their plans." Jerome shifted in his saddle, his horse moving restlessly beneath him. "Word is you're looking for work." The statement was casual, but something in his tone suggested more than idle curiosity. "I am. Unfortunately, the opportunities in town seem to be limited." Town opportunities usually are, especially for people who don't fit the local definition of suitable. Jerome's voice carried the weight of personal experience with exclusion and judgment. "Ranch work might offer better possibilities if you're interested in that kind of employment." Isabel felt a spark of hope at the suggestion, though years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious about reading too much into casual comments. "I have experience with ranch operations. I grew up helping manage my father's property in California." "What kind of operation did he run?" "Cattle and horses primarily. Some grain production for feed and local market. I handled much of the bookkeeping and correspondence with buyers and suppliers." Isabel found herself relaxing slightly as she talked about familiar subjects, the kind of work that had given her life structure and purpose before her father's death had changed everything. Jerome nodded approvingly. "Those are valuable skills. Out here, not many people understand both the practical and business sides of ranching." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I've been thinking about hiring someone to help with the administrative side of my operation, record keeping, correspondence, supply ordering, that sort of thing. It's not glamorous work, but it pays fair wages and includes room and board." The offer came so unexpectedly that Isabel wasn't sure she had heard correctly. After a morning of rejections and growing despair about her prospects, the possibility of employment felt almost too good to be true. "That sounds like exactly the kind of position I'd be interested in," she said carefully, unwilling to appear too eager but unable to hide her relief entirely. "What would the arrangement involve?" "My ranch has a main house and several outbuildings, including quarters for hired help. The work would primarily involve maintaining records, managing correspondence with buyers and suppliers, and helping coordinate the business aspects of ranch operations. Hours would be regular, and you'd have Sundays off unless there were emergencies." Isabel felt as though she'd been offered a lifeline when she was on the verge of drowning. "Mr. Walker, I'm very interested in the position. When would you need someone to start?" "Soon as possible. Been putting off the administrative work too long, and it's starting to catch up with me." Jerome gathered his reins, preparing to move on. "Why don't you think it over tonight, and if you're still interested tomorrow, ride out to my place and we can discuss the details." "I don't have a horse," Isabel admitted. embarrassed by the practical limitation that might prevent her from pursuing the opportunity. "There's a livery stable next to the hotel. Tell Tom Bradshaw I sent you, and he'll rent you a mount for the day. The ride's about 2 hours each way, good road most of the distance." Jerome touched his hat again and guided his horse down the street, leaving Isabel standing on the corner with her mind racing through the implications of his unexpected offer. Employment, with room and board, would solve her immediate problems of survival and give her time to establish herself in the area. But working for a man she had just met would require a level of trust that her recent experiences had made difficult. More importantly, she sensed that Jerome Walker's offer would not be viewed favorably by the established residents of Cedar Falls. His mixed heritage and his willingness to employ her despite the scandal surrounding her arrival would likely make both of them targets for increased scrutiny and disapproval from the community. But the alternative was accepting defeat and returning to California with nothing to show for her journey, except painful lessons about the persistence of prejudice and the limitations placed on women who didn't fit society's narrow definitions of acceptability. The prospect of retreat felt like abandoning not just her own hopes, but the possibility that somewhere in the vast territory of the American West there might be places where character mattered more than bloodline. That evening, as Isabel sat in her small hotel room and weighed her options, she could hear the sounds of Cedar Falls settling into its nightly routine. Somewhere below, the hotel's other guests were preparing for sleep, unaware that the woman they viewed as a problem was contemplating a decision that would soon affect far more than just her own future. She thought about her father, who had built a successful ranch through hard work and determination, despite the social obstacles created by his marriage to a Pueblo woman. She remembered her mother's quiet strength in the face of discrimination and exclusion, her refusal to be diminished by people who judged her worth based on race rather than character. Most importantly, she considered the man who had offered her employment when everyone else had seen only problems and complications. Jerome Walker had looked at her and seen someone with skills and experience, rather than someone whose heritage made her unsuitable for respectable society. That alone was worth the risk of whatever challenges might come from accepting his offer. By morning, Isabel had made her decision. She would ride out to the Walker Ranch and accept whatever employment Jerome was willing to offer, regardless of how the community might react to her choice. The path of retreat was always available if circumstances became unbearable, but the opportunity to build something new in Colorado territory might never come again. As she prepared for the journey that would determine her immediate future, Isabel had no way of knowing that her decision to work for Jerome Walker would set in motion conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface of Cedar Falls society. For years, she couldn't have predicted that her employment would be viewed as a challenge to the established order, or that some members of the community would see her presence at the Walker Ranch as justification for actions that would test everyone's commitment to the principles of law and civilization they claimed to uphold. The second chapter of her life in Colorado was about to begin with hope and determination, but it would soon evolve into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple employment arrangement between two people who understood what it meant to be judged by others who had never walked in their footsteps. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Isabel guided her rented mare along the winding trail toward the Walker Ranch. The horse Tom Bradshaw had provided was a steady bay with gentle manners, though he had made his reluctance to deal with her clear through his gruff demeanor and inflated rental price. Word of Jerome Walker's employment offer had apparently spread through Cedar Falls overnight, adding another layer of controversy to her already scandalous presence in the community. The landscape gradually changed from the settled farmland around, and town to wilder country dotted with stands of aspen and pine. Cattle grazed in distant meadows, their lazy movements suggesting the kind of peaceful prosperity that came from careful management and favorable conditions. The air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter, and Isabel found herself breathing more easily the farther she traveled from the suspicious stares and whispered conversations of Cedar Falls. The Walker Ranch announced itself through a weathered wooden sign at the entrance to a well-maintained drive. Beyond lay a collection of buildings that spoke of practical functionality rather than the social pretensions she had observed at the Carter place. The main house was a single-story structure built from local stone and timber, its design clearly influenced by the practical needs of ranch life rather than Eastern architectural fashions. Outbuildings included a large barn, corrals, and several smaller structures that probably housed equipment and seasonal workers. Jerome emerged from the barn as she approached, wiping his hands on a cloth and moving with the easy confidence of a man completely comfortable in his environment. He wore work clothes that showed honest wear and dust, marking him as someone who participated directly in the labor required to maintain his operation, rather than simply supervising from a distance. "Miss Martinez," he said, approaching her horse with the kind of calm authority that animals instinctively respected. "I wasn't entirely certain you'd decide to make the trip." "I'm very interested in the position you described," Isabel replied, accepting his assistance as she dismounted. "That is, assuming the offer is still available." "It is." Jerome studied her with the same thoughtful attention she remembered from their street encounter, his dark eyes taking in her practical traveling clothes and the way she handled herself around the horse. "Why don't we walk through the operation so you can see what you'd be getting yourself into?" The tour that followed revealed an enterprise of impressive scope and organization. Jerome ran a mixed operation focused primarily on cattle, but including horses, sheep, and enough agricultural production to support his livestock and provide modest surplus for local markets. His records were kept in a combination of ledger books and loose papers that clearly represented years of accumulated information without systematic organization. "The bookkeeping has gotten away from me," Jerome admitted, as they stood in what served as his office, a spare room in the main house lined with shelves holding a chaotic mixture of correspondence, invoices, and handwritten notes. "I can track the day-to-day operations well enough, but the bigger picture gets lost in all the details." Isabel examined the papers scattered across his desk, immediately recognizing patterns and relationships that would allow for systematic organization. "How many head of cattle are you currently running?" "About 800 head, plus maybe 50 horses and a couple hundred sheep. The cattle are the main operation, but the horses bring good prices from the army and civilian buyers who need quality mounts." "What about seasonal help? How many people do you employ during peak periods?" Jerome's expression grew slightly guarded, and Isabel sensed that she had touched on a subject that carried complications beyond simple business considerations. "That depends on the year and the kind of help I can find. Some seasons I've had crews of 15 or 20 men. Other times I've made do with half that number." "Is finding workers a problem in this area?" "Finding good workers is always a challenge. Finding workers who'll work for me specifically can be more difficult." Jerome's voice carried undertones that suggested personal experience, with the kind of discrimination that had already affected her own job search. Isabel nodded, understanding immediately what he meant without requiring detailed explanation. "I see. What about the business relationships with buyers and suppliers? Any particular challenges there?" "Some. There are people who prefer not to deal with me directly, so I sometimes have to work through intermediaries or accept less favorable terms than I might otherwise negotiate." Jerome moved to the window, gazing out at the pastoral scene of cattle grazing in nearby pastures. The ranch produces good stock and turns a reliable profit, but social complications sometimes affect the business side of operations. The honest assessment of his situation impressed Isabel more than elaborate promises or attempts to minimize the challenges they would both face. Jerome Walker was offering her employment with full awareness that her presence would likely increase the social difficulties he already navigated as a mixed-blood rancher operating in a predominantly white community. "Mr. Walker, I appreciate your candor about the situation. May I ask why you're willing to hire me when you know it might create additional problems for your business?" Jerome turned from the window, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Because I need help with the administrative work, and you have the skills to provide that help. Because I believe people should be judged by their abilities and character, rather than their ancestry. And because I know what it's like to be excluded from opportunities based on things you can't control and didn't choose." The simple directness of his answer carried more weight than elaborate speeches about fairness and equality might have managed. Isabel found herself trusting this man who offered employment without demanding gratitude or submission, who acknowledged difficulties without claiming he could eliminate them entirely. "The position interests me very much," she said. "What would the specific arrangements be?" $40 a month plus room and board, 6 days a week, reasonable hours. You'd have your own quarters in the house, separate entrance, complete privacy. Work would primarily involve organizing the business records, managing correspondence, and helping coordinate supply orders and sales arrangements. The salary was more generous than Isabel had expected, significantly better than most employment. Available to women regardless of their background, the living arrangements would provide both security and independence, crucial considerations for a woman in her position. "I accept your offer, Mr. Walker. When would you like me to start?" "As soon as you can arrange to move your belongings out here. Tomorrow, if that works for you." They spent the remainder of the morning discussing practical details and touring the facilities that would be part of her daily responsibilities. Jerome's approach to ranch management impressed her with its combination of traditional methods and innovative adaptations to local conditions. His livestock were healthy and well-maintained, his facilities were functional and properly maintained, and his operation clearly generated the kind of steady profits that came from competent management rather than speculation or shortcuts. The ride back to Cedar Falls gave Isabel time to consider the implications of her decision. Employment at the Walker Ranch would solve her immediate financial problems and provide the stability she needed to establish herself in Colorado territory. But it would also align her publicly with a man whose own social position was precarious, potentially closing doors that might otherwise remain open to her. More concerning was the growing certainty that certain elements of the Cedar Falls community viewed her presence as a challenge to established social hierarchies that required response. The comments from the men at the Silver Dollar Saloon had carried undertones of hostility that went beyond casual prejudice into something approaching threat. She was so absorbed in these considerations that she almost missed the sound of approaching hoofbeats behind her. 3 riders were closing the distance between them with the kind of purposeful pursuit that immediately triggered her instincts for caution and self-preservation. Isabel urged her mare to increase pace, but the rented horse was no match for the fresher mounts behind her. Within minutes, the riders had caught up and positioned themselves to block her progress along the narrow trail. She recognized 2 of them from the group that had harassed her outside the saloon, while the third was Samuel Carter himself, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been wounded pride. "Miss Martinez," Samuel said, his tone carrying false politeness that made the address sound like an accusation. Fancy meeting you out here on the road to Jerome Walker's place." Isabel kept her hands steady on the reins, projecting calm confidence despite the racing of her heart. "Mr. Carter, gentlemen, is there something you need? Just curious about your business with that half-breed rancher," one of the other men said, with a leering grin that made her skin crawl. "Heard you might be taking up residence out there." "My employment arrangements are my own concern," Isabel replied evenly, recognizing that any sign of fear or uncertainty would only encourage their behavior. Samuel's face darkened at her response. "Employment, is that what we're calling it? Mighty convenient arrangement, you and Walker both being the same kind of people." The implication was clear and deliberately insulting, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever they were planning to do next. Isabel forced herself to remain calm, though anger burned in her chest at the casual assumption that her character could be judged by her race and circumstances. "I'm going to continue my journey now," she said, attempting to guide her horse around the blockade they had created. "Not so fast," the third man said, moving his mount to block her path more completely. "See, we got some concerns about this arrangement you're making with Walker. Nothing personal, you understand, but Cedar Falls is a respectable community, and we like to keep it that way." "What exactly are you concerned about?" Isabel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Samuel leaned forward in his saddle, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he had used when rejecting her marriage proposal. "We're concerned about the example this sets for other respectable families in the area. Bad enough that Walker runs his operation the way he does, hiring drifters and troublemakers. Now he's bringing in a woman of questionable background to live on his property. People are going to talk." "Let them talk," Isabel said quietly. "I'm not responsible for controlling other people's opinions or conversations." "But you are responsible for your own choices," one of the other men interjected. "And right now, you're making choices that could cause problems for everyone involved." The threat was becoming more explicit, though still wrapped in language that maintained a veneer of reasonableness. Isabel realized that these men had planned this confrontation, probably coordinated it to intercept her return journey when she would be alone and vulnerable on the isolated trail. "What exactly are you suggesting I do differently?" she asked, buying time while assessing her options. "For escape or self-defense?" "We're suggesting you reconsider this employment arrangement," Samuel said. "Accept my original offer to pay for your return to California. Leave quietly, and everyone can forget this unfortunate situation ever happened. And if I don't choose to leave..." The three men exchanged glances that carried clear meaning. Samuel's expression hardened into something approaching genuine malice. "Then you might find that life in Cedar Falls becomes very difficult for you and for anyone who chooses to associate with you." The threat was now completely open, though still phrased in language that would allow them to claim they had been offering friendly advice rather than making explicit intimidation. Isabel understood that she was facing men who believed their social position gave them the right to control her choices and punish her for decisions they disapproved of. "Thank you for your concern," she said, her voice steady despite the danger of her situation. "I'll give your suggestions all the consideration they deserve." Something in her tone seemed to penetrate Samuel's anger, and his eyes narrowed as he studied her expression. "You're making a mistake, Miss Martinez. A serious mistake that could have consequences you haven't considered. The only mistake I see is three grown men threatening a woman traveling alone on a public road," Isabel replied. "I'm sure Sheriff Brooks would be interested to hear about this conversation." The mention of law enforcement seemed to give them pause, though Isabel wasn't certain how much protection official authority would actually provide, given the social dynamics she had already observed in Cedar Falls. "No threats here," one of the other men said with a false laugh. "Just neighbors having a friendly conversation about community standards and mutual respect." "Of course," Isabel said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to return to town before dark." This time they allowed her to pass, though she could feel their eyes following her progress down the trail. The encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit, not just because of the immediate threat they represented, but because of what their behavior suggested about the level of hostility her employment with Jerome Walker would generate. By the time she reached the livery stable in Cedar Falls, Isabel had made several important decisions. She would accept Jerome's employment offer and move to the Walker Ranch as quickly as possible, both for the opportunities it provided and for the security of being away from the increasingly hostile atmosphere of the town. She would also need to be extremely careful about her movements and associations, recognizing that certain elements of the community were prepared to escalate their opposition to her presence into something approaching active persecution. Most importantly, she would need to warn Jerome about the level of hostility his decision to employ her was generating among influential members of the community. Whatever social difficulties he had faced as a mixed-blood rancher were likely to increase significantly once she became part of his operation. That evening, as she packed her few belongings in preparation for leaving the hotel, Isabel reflected on how quickly her situation in Cedar Falls had escalated from social rejection to open threats. The men who had confronted her on the trail clearly viewed her employment with Jerome as a challenge to their authority and social position that required response. She thought about her father, who had faced similar threats when he married her mother and established his ranch in California. He had met hostility with quiet determination and steady focus on building something worthwhile, despite the obstacles placed in his path. Her mother had demonstrated that dignity and strength could triumph over prejudice and intimidation, that refusing to be diminished by small-minded people was itself a form of victory. The decision to work for Jerome Walker would test everything she had learned about courage and perseverance in the face of systematic discrimination. But the alternative was retreat and defeat, abandonment of the possibility that somewhere in the vast territory of the American West there might be communities where character mattered more than bloodline and where people could build meaningful lives regardless of the circumstances of their birth. As she prepared for sleep in the cramped hotel room, Isabel could hear the sounds of Cedar Falls settling into its nightly routine. Somewhere in the darkness, she knew, men were probably planning additional attempts to pressure her into leaving or to punish Jerome Walker for his decision to employ her. The confrontation on the trail had been a warning, but she suspected it would not be the last or most serious challenge she would face. The morning would bring her departure from the hotel and her arrival at the Walker Ranch, marking the beginning of a new chapter in her life that would test not just her administrative skills and work ethic, but her courage and determination to build a future despite the opposition of people who believed her heritage disqualified her from participating in their vision of civilized society. As she drifted toward sleep, Isabel's last conscious thought was of Jerome Walker's steady gaze and honest assessment of the challenges they would face together. In a world where most people saw only problems and complications when they looked at her, he had seen someone with skills and potential worth the risk of social disapproval and economic pressure. Tomorrow would reveal whether that judgment had been accurate, and whether the partnership they were forming could survive the tests that were surely coming from those who viewed their association as an unacceptable challenge to the established order of things. The early morning frost crunched beneath the wheels of the wagon as Jerome guided his team along Main Street toward the Cedar Falls Hotel. Isabel had sent word through Tom Bradshaw at the livery stable that she was ready to relocate to the ranch, and Jerome had offered to help transport her belongings rather than requiring her to make the journey alone with her trunk and personal effects. The streets were unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning, with fewer people visible than Jerome normally. Expected during the busy period when merchants opened their establishments and townspeople conducted their morning business. Those who were present seemed to watch the wagon's progress with unusual interest, their conversations stopping as he passed and resuming in hushed tones that suggested his presence was the subject of considerable discussion. Jerome had lived with community disapproval for most of his adult life, but something about the atmosphere this morning felt different from the usual undercurrent of social exclusion he had learned to navigate. The tension seemed more focused, more purposeful, as if events were building towards some kind of confrontation that he couldn't yet identify, but could sense approaching like a storm on the horizon. Isabel emerged from the hotel carrying a carpet bag and wearing the same practical traveling clothes she had worn during her visit to the ranch. Her posture was erect and her expression calm, but Jerome noticed the way her eyes automatically scanned the street and nearby buildings, the kind of vigilant awareness that came from recognizing potential threats in her environment. "Good morning, Miss Martinez," he said, climbing down from the wagon seat to help with her belongings. "I hope you're not having second thoughts about the arrangement." "Not at all, Mr. Walker. I'm very much looking forward to beginning work." Isabel's voice carried determination, despite the obvious tension of the situation. "My trunk is upstairs. The hotel clerk has been less than helpful about arranging for its transport." Jerome wasn't surprised by the clerk's attitude, recognizing another example of the petty harassment that people like himself and Isabel faced when conducting ordinary business in communities that viewed their presence as problematic. "We'll manage it ourselves. No point in depending on cooperation from people who've already decided to be difficult." They made their way upstairs to Isabel's room, where her trunk sat packed and ready for departure. The contents represented everything she owned in the world, a modest collection of clothing, books, and personal items that spoke of someone who had learned to travel light and value practicality over luxury. As they maneuvered the trunk down the narrow staircase, Jerome became aware that the hotel's other guests and staff were watching their progress with the kind of intense interest usually reserved for theatrical performances or public scandals. Conversations stopped as they passed, and several people positioned themselves to get better views of the proceedings. The clerk behind the front desk looked up from his newspaper as they reached the lobby, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone witnessing the resolution of a problem that had been causing him inconvenience. "Checking out, Miss Martinez?" he asked with false pleasantry. "I hope your stay met your expectations." "It was adequate," Isabel replied neutrally, refusing to provide him with any dramatic reactions he might share with future customers as entertainment. "Well, I'm sure you'll find your new arrangements more suitable to your particular circumstances," the clerk continued, his tone suggesting that he knew exactly what those arrangements were and disapproved thoroughly. Jerome felt his jaw tighten at the barely concealed insult, but Isabel's calm composure prevented him from responding in ways that would only create additional complications. Instead, he focused on loading her belongings into the wagon and preparing for the journey back to his ranch. It was while they were securing the trunk in the wagon bed that Samuel Carter appeared on the boardwalk across the street, flanked by the same two men who had accompanied him during Isabel's confrontation on the trail. The three stood watching the loading process with expressions of barely concealed hostility, their presence clearly intended as intimidation rather than coincidental observation. "Friends of yours?" Jerome asked quietly, noticing the direction of Isabel's gaze. "We've met," Isabel replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Carter was kind enough to offer his opinions about my employment arrangements." Jerome studied the three men across the street, recognizing the type even if he didn't know their specific identities. Samuel Carter, he knew by reputation as someone whose social ambitions exceeded his actual accomplishments, a man who traded on family connections and inherited advantages rather than personal merit. The other two had the look of followers rather than leaders, men who gained importance through association with people they perceived as more powerful or influential. Any particular reason they're taking such interest in your departure? They seem to believe my presence in Cedar Falls reflects poorly on community standards, Isabel said. They've suggested that my leaving would benefit everyone involved. The casual way she summarized what had obviously been a more threatening encounter impressed Jerome with her ability to remain composed under pressure. He suspected there was considerably more to the story than she was revealing, but this wasn't the time or place for detailed discussions about the level of hostility she was facing. Well, they're about to get their wish regarding your departure. From town, Jerome said, helping Isabel onto the wagon seat. Question is whether they'll be satisfied with that or decide to extend their concerns to your employment situation. As they drove out of Cedar Falls, Jerome noticed that several other people had positioned themselves along the route to observe their departure. Some faces showed simple curiosity, but others carried expressions of disapproval or outright hostility that suggested Isabel's presence had become a divisive issue within the community. The journey to the Walker Ranch took them through increasingly wild country, past scattered homesteads and ranching operations that represented the advancing edge of settlement in the Colorado Territory. The autumn landscape was magnificent, with aspen groves showing brilliant gold against the dark green of pine forests and the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains providing a dramatic backdrop to the rolling grasslands. "It's beautiful country," Isabel said as they crested a hill that provided sweeping views of the valley containing Jerome's ranch. "Very different from California, but beautiful in its own way." "It grows on you," Jerome agreed. "Took me a while to appreciate it fully when I first came here. The winters can be harsh, and the isolation takes some getting used to, but there's something about the openness and possibilities that makes up for the difficulties." "How long have you been ranching here?" "About 8 years. Bought the original property from a family that decided frontier life wasn't for them, then gradually added adjacent parcels as they became available." Jerome guided the wagon down the winding road toward his buildings. "It's been a challenge, building something sustainable. But the land is good, and the market opportunities keep improving as more people move into the territory." Isabel nodded, clearly interested in the business aspects of his operation. "What are the main challenges you face in marketing your livestock?" "Transportation costs, seasonal variations in demand, and the usual problems with finding reliable buyers who pay fair prices on time." Jerome paused, then decided to address the issue that was likely to affect their business relationship directly. Plus, the complications that come from dealing with people who prefer not to do business with someone like me if they can avoid it. "Because of your heritage?" "Partly that. Partly just general suspicion of anyone who doesn't fit easily into established social categories. My mother was Cheyenne. My father was a fur trader of Irish descent who stayed in the territory after most of the beaver were trapped out. That combination makes some people uncomfortable, especially when it comes to business relationships that require trust and long-term commitments." Isabel was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering the implications of what he had shared. "Have you found ways to work around those attitudes?" "Some. I've built relationships with buyers in Denver and Kansas City who care more about the quality of my stock than my ancestry. I've also found that demonstrating reliability and competence over time tends to overcome initial prejudices, at least among people who are primarily interested in profitable business relationships." "That's encouraging. I hope to prove similarly valuable in managing the administrative aspects of your operation." They spent the remainder of the journey discussing practical details about ranch operations and Isabel's role in managing the business correspondence and record-keeping that had been consuming increasing amounts of Jerome's time. Her questions demonstrated both genuine interest and considerable knowledge about the complexities of running a successful ranching operation in frontier conditions. The ranch buildings looked welcoming in the afternoon sunlight, with smoke rising from the main house chimney and the peaceful sounds of livestock in nearby pastures. Jerome's hired hands, a mixture of experienced cowboys and seasonal workers, watched their arrival with curiosity, but without the hostility that had characterized most of Isabel's encounters in Cedar Falls. "Miss Martinez will be handling the business records and correspondence," Jerome announced as he helped Isabel down from the wagon. "She'll be working out of the office in the main house and living in the guest quarters." The men nodded respectfully, treating the introduction as routine business rather than scandalous news. Isabel found herself relaxing slightly in the absence of the judgmental stares and whispered comments that had become constant features of her life in town. Jerome showed her to her quarters, a comfortable room with its own entrance that had been furnished with practical furniture and basic amenities. The space was clean and private, offering the kind of independence that would allow her to maintain appropriate boundaries while working closely with Jerome on ranch business. "The office is through that door," Jerome explained, indicating a connecting passage. "You'll have access to all the business records and correspondence, plus whatever supplies you need for organizing and maintaining the files." Isabel examined the office space, immediately seeing opportunities for organizing the accumulated papers and records into systematic files that would make information readily accessible when needed. "This will work very well. How would you like me to prioritize the various tasks? Start with whatever seems most urgent to you. I trust your judgment about what needs attention first." Jerome paused at the door. "Dinner's at 6 if you'd like to join me, or you can take your meals in your quarters if you prefer more privacy." I'd be happy to join you for dinner. It will give us an opportunity to discuss business matters and coordinate our approach to various projects." The first week of Isabel's employment at the Walker Ranch established patterns that proved both productive and comfortable for both parties. Her organizational skills quickly brought order to Jerome's chaotic business records, while her knowledge of ranching operations allowed her to contribute meaningfully to discussions about marketing, strategies, and operational improvements. More importantly, the work environment provided Isabel with the kind of respect and professional recognition that had been missing from her previous attempts to establish herself in Colorado territory. Jerome treated her as a valued colleague, rather than a problematic employee, consulting her opinions on business matters and implementing her suggestions for improving administrative efficiency. The ranch hands accepted her presence without drama, recognizing that her work made their own jobs easier by ensuring that supplies arrived on time, payroll was managed efficiently, and business correspondence was handled promptly. Several of them had backgrounds that included their own experiences with discrimination and exclusion, making them naturally sympathetic to someone who was trying to build a life despite social obstacles. But the peaceful productivity of life at the Walker Ranch was shattered on a Friday evening when Jerome returned from a supply trip to Cedar Falls with news that confirmed Isabel's worst fears about the level of hostility her employment was generating among certain elements of the community. "We need to talk," Jerome said as he dismounted from his horse, his expression grim in the fading daylight. "There are developments in town that you need to know about." Isabel felt her stomach clench with apprehension as they walked toward the main house. The tone of Jerome's voice suggested that whatever he had learned was serious enough to threaten the stability they had established over the past week. "Samuel Carter and his friends have been busy," Jerome began once they were seated in the office where their conversations couldn't be overheard by the ranch hands. They've organized what they're calling a citizens committee to address what they describe as threats to community standards and moral values. What sort of threats are they claiming to address? According to the broadsheet they've been distributing around town, the committee is concerned about the influence of undesirable elements on local families and businesses. They specifically mention the dangers of allowing people with questionable backgrounds and immoral associations to establish themselves in respectable communities. Isabel didn't need to ask whether she and Jerome were among the undesirable elements being referenced. What actions are they proposing to take? They're calling for a boycott of businesses that employ or associate with people who don't meet their standards of community acceptability. They're also organizing what they describe as protective patrols to monitor activities that might threaten local families and property. The implications were chilling. Economic boycotts could seriously damage Jerome's ability to conduct business with local suppliers and service providers, while vigilante patrols could easily escalate into violence against people they viewed as threats to community values. How much support are they getting from other townspeople? Jerome's expression darkened further. More than I'd hoped, less than they probably wanted. Sheriff Brooks told me privately that he's concerned about the situation but doesn't see any legal grounds for intervening unless they actually break the law. He advised me to be careful about my movements in town and to make sure you don't travel there alone. Isabel felt cold despite the warmth of the office fire. The situation was escalating beyond social disapproval into something approaching organized persecution, with law enforcement unable or unwilling to provide protection until actual crimes were committed. Have they made any specific threats against the ranch or our business operations? Not directly, but the implications are clear enough. They want you gone, and they want me to understand that employing you will have consequences for my ability to operate successfully in this area. Jerome leaned back in his chair, his face showing the strain of dealing with pressures that went far beyond normal business challenges. "Mr. Walker," Isabel said quietly, "I don't want my presence here to destroy what you've built. If my leaving would resolve these problems—" "Your leaving would resolve nothing," Jerome interrupted firmly. "It would just confirm that threats and intimidation are effective tools for controlling people's choices. Besides, I hired you because I needed your skills, and those needs haven't changed just because some narrow-minded people have decided to make trouble." Despite his words, Isabel could see the worry in Jerome's eyes. The ranch represented years of hard work and substantial investment, and the economic pressure that Carter's committee could generate might seriously threaten its long-term viability. "What do you think they'll do next?" "I'm not sure, but I suspect they're planning something more dramatic than broadsheets and boycott threats. Men like Samuel Carter don't organize committees and patrols unless they're building towards some kind of confrontation that will allow them to demonstrate their power and authority." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Through the office window, Isabel could see torches moving in the darkness, too many and too organized to represent casual travelers or neighboring ranchers making social calls. Jerome moved quickly to the gun case in the corner of the office, removing a rifle and checking to ensure it was loaded. "Stay away from the windows and be ready to move if I tell you to." The approaching riders numbered at least a dozen, their torches creating a circle of flickering light around the ranch. Buildings. They stopped just outside the main yard, close enough to be clearly visible, but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation with anyone in the house. "Jerome Walker," a voice called from the darkness beyond the torches. Isabel recognized Samuel Carter's tone, though he was clearly trying to project authority and official purpose rather than personal animosity. We need to speak with you about a matter of community concern. Jerome stepped onto the front porch, keeping his rifle. Visible but not directly threatening. It's late for social calls, Carter. What's this about? The Cedar Falls Citizens Committee has voted to address the situation regarding your employment of undesirable persons who represent a threat to local moral standards and family values, Samuel announced, his words carrying the kind of formal pomposity that suggested he had rehearsed this speech carefully. I employ people based on their skills and work ethic, Jerome replied evenly. My business arrangements are my own concern, not subject to approval by self-appointed committees. That's where you're wrong, another voice called from among the mounted men. When your choices affect the entire community, they become everyone's concern. Isabel remained in the office, watching through a gap in the curtains as the confrontation developed. She could see the tension in Jerome's posture, the careful way he held his rifle, and the aggressive positioning of the mounted men who clearly outnumbered anyone at the ranch. What exactly are you demanding? Jerome asked. The immediate dismissal of the Martinez woman and her departure from the territory, Samuel replied. We're prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience, but her continued presence is unacceptable to decent people in this community. Miss Martinez is a valued employee who has done nothing wrong except have the misfortune to be rejected by you for reasons that reflect poorly on your character rather than hers, Jerome said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. Her character isn't the issue, someone else shouted. It's what she represents, the example she sets, the encouragement she gives to other undesirable elements who might think they can establish themselves here. Isabel felt sick as she listened to men discussing her fate as if she were property, to be disposed of rather than a human being with rights and dignity. The casual dehumanization was perhaps worse than outright hatred, reducing her to a symbol in their struggle to maintain social hierarchies that placed them at the top and people like her at the bottom. Gentlemen, Jerome said, you've delivered your message. Now I suggest you leave my property before this situation escalates beyond anyone's ability to control it. We're not leaving until we have your commitment that the woman will be dismissed and removed from the area, Samuel declared. The community has spoken and its will must be respected. The standoff stretched through several tense minutes, with Jerome standing alone on his porch, facing a dozen mounted men who clearly believed their numbers gave them the authority to dictate terms. Isabel realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her immediate future, but the question of whether people like her and Jerome could build lives in communities dominated by those who viewed their very existence as a threat to established order. The crisis point had arrived, and there was no predicting how it would resolve or what the consequences would be for everyone involved in the confrontation that was about to determine the balance of power between tolerance and prejudice in Cedar Falls, Colorado territory. The standoff stretched through the cold night air like a taut wire ready to snap. Jerome stood motionless on his porch, rifle in hand, facing the circle of torchlight that revealed hostile faces and gleaming weapons. Isabel remained hidden in the office, her heart pounding as she watched the confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the kind of community Cedar Falls would become. The silence was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the darkness beyond the circle of mounted men. A single rider emerged from the shadows, his badge catching the flickering torchlight as Sheriff Daniel Brooks guided his horse through the crowd of vigilantes with calm authority. "Evening, gentlemen," Sheriff Brooks said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of dealing with volatile situations. "Mighty late for social calls, wouldn't you say?" Samuel Carter straightened in his saddle, clearly unprepared for official law enforcement to interrupt his carefully planned demonstration of community power. "Sheriff Brooks, this is a private matter between concerned citizens and Mr. Walker." regarding community standards, private matter that requires a dozen armed men on someone else's property. Sheriff Brooks positioned his horse between the vigilantes and Jerome's porch, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. "That doesn't sound very private to me. We're here as representatives of the Cedar Falls citizens. Committee," another man declared, "we have every right to express our concerns about threats to community welfare." "You have the right to express concerns," Sheriff Brooks agreed. "You don't have the right to trespass on private property with weapons and torches, making demands backed by implied threats of violence." Isabel felt a wave of relief at the sheriff's intervention, though she remained uncertain how much protection he could actually provide against a group that clearly believed their social position placed them above normal legal constraints. "Sheriff," Samuel said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality he used when addressing people he considered beneath his station, "surely you understand that some situations require community action when official channels prove inadequate." "What I understand," Sheriff Brooks replied evenly, "is that vigilante committees and midnight raids are how lawless territories stay lawless. Colorado's working towards statehood, and that means we settle disputes through courts and elected officials, not through mobs with torches." Jerome remained silent on his porch, recognizing that the sheriff's presence had shifted the confrontation into different territory, but unwilling to assume that official intervention would necessarily resolve the underlying conflict in his favor. "The woman needs to go," one of the mounted men shouted. "She's a corrupting influence on community values." "Miss Martinez is a lawful resident employed in legitimate work," Sheriff Brooks stated firmly. "Unless someone has evidence of actual wrongdoing, her presence here is protected by the same laws that protect everyone else in this territory. Laws that protect decent people from undesirable elements," Samuel corrected. "Laws that give communities the right to maintain standards appropriate to civilized society." Sheriff Brooks studied the group of mounted men with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was memorizing faces and assessing individual commitment to whatever action they were contemplating. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to disperse peacefully and return to your homes. Anyone who chooses to remain on Mr. Walker's property without his permission will be arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace." "You can't arrest all of us," someone called from the back of the group. "Maybe not," Sheriff Brooks acknowledged, "but I can arrest the leaders, and I can make sure territorial authorities understand that Cedar Falls has a problem with vigilante activity that requires attention from federal marshals." The threat of federal intervention seemed to give the group pause. Federal marshals had considerably more authority and fewer local political considerations than county sheriffs, and their involvement would attract the kind of attention that could interfere with business and political relationships throughout the territory. Samuel Carter clearly recognized that the situation was slipping beyond his control, but backing down in front of his followers would undermine the authority he was trying to establish through this demonstration. "This isn't over," he announced, trying to project determination despite the obvious failure of his intimidation tactics. "The committee will continue to monitor this situation and take appropriate action to protect community interests." "You do that," Sheriff Brooks replied. "Just make sure your monitoring stays within legal boundaries, or you'll find yourself explaining your methods to a federal judge." The mounted men began dispersing reluctantly, their torches creating moving points of light as they rode back toward town. Samuel Carter remained until the last, his face showing the kind of frustrated anger that came from having a carefully planned demonstration of power defused by unexpected intervention. "This conversation isn't finished, Walker," he said as he prepared to follow his companions. "Yes, it is," Jerome replied quietly, "unless you want to have it in court with lawyers present." After the last of the vigilantes had disappeared into The darkness. Sheriff Brooks dismounted and approached the porch where Jerome still stood with his rifle. "That was well handled," the sheriff said, "keeping your temper when they were trying to provoke you into doing something stupid." "I learned early that angry reactions usually make bad situations worse," Jerome replied. "But I appreciate your timing. Things were heading toward trouble that nobody would have been able to control." That's exactly what Carter was hoping for. If you'd started shooting, or if his men had decided to rush the house, people would have gotten hurt, and he could have claimed you were the aggressor, threatening peaceful citizens. Isabel emerged from the office, her face pale but composed, as she joined the two men on the porch. Sheriff Brooks touched his hat respectfully, his manner suggesting genuine concern rather than mere politeness. "Miss Martinez, I'm sorry you had to witness that display. It doesn't represent the values that most people in Cedar Falls actually hold." "Thank you, Sheriff. I'm grateful for your intervention tonight." Isabel paused, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind throughout the confrontation. "Do you think they'll try something like this again?" Sheriff Brooks considered the question carefully before responding. "Carter's committee has shown their hand now, and it wasn't as strong as they hoped. Most of the men who rode out here tonight were followers, not leaders. Once they have time to think about the legal consequences of vigilante activity, most of them will lose their enthusiasm for midnight raids." "What about Carter himself?" Jerome asked. "Carter's a different problem. He's built his reputation on being a community leader, and backing down from this confrontation will damage that reputation. He'll be looking for other ways to pressure you both, probably through economic means rather than direct confrontation." The assessment proved accurate over the following weeks, as Samuel Carter and his remaining supporters launched a campaign of economic harassment designed to force Jerome out of business through boycotts and pressure on his suppliers and customers. Several merchants in Cedar Falls stopped dealing with the Walker Ranch, citing concerns about community approval, while others raised their prices or demanded cash payment instead of extending the credit terms that were standard practice for established customers. More seriously, Carter used his political connections to challenge Jerome's water rights and grazing permits, filing complaints that required expensive legal responses and created uncertainty about the ranch's long-term viability. The harassment was systematic and persistent, designed to create enough financial pressure to force Jerome to dismiss Isabel and conform to community expectations about appropriate employment practices. But the economic warfare had unintended consequences that ultimately undermined Carter's position more than it damaged Jerome's ranch operations. Several business owners in Cedar Falls privately disagreed with the boycott tactics, viewing them as bad precedent that could be used against anyone who fell out of favor with influential families. Others simply found that the loss of the Walker Ranch's business hurt their own profits more than they had anticipated. Most importantly, word of the situation spread beyond Cedar Falls to other communities in the territory, attracting attention from newspapers and political figures who were concerned about the implications of vigilante activity and economic persecution. An editorial in the Denver Republican strongly criticized the backwards thinking and mob tactics that were damaging Colorado's reputation as it sought statehood, while territorial politicians privately warned that federal authorities were taking notice of communities that couldn't maintain law and order through proper legal channels. The pressure gradually shifted as Jerome found new suppliers and customers in Denver and other markets that were more interested in the quality of his livestock than the politics of his employment practices. His ranch operations proved resilient enough to absorb the short-term losses from local boycotts, while the systematic organization of his business records allowed him to pursue legal remedies for the various challenges to his permits and water rights. Isabel's administrative skills proved crucial during this period, as she coordinated the complex legal and business responses required to counter Carter's harassment campaign. Her correspondence with lawyers, suppliers, and territorial officials demonstrated the kind of professional competence that gradually earned respect from people who had initially been skeptical about her background and qualifications. More personally, the shared experience of facing organized hostility deepened the working relationship between Jerome and Isabel into something approaching genuine partnership. Their collaboration on business matters evolved into broader discussions about their goals and aspirations, their shared experiences with discrimination and exclusion, and their hopes for building meaningful lives despite the obstacles placed in their path by people who judged them by ancestry rather than character. The turning point came in early spring, when an unexpected visitor arrived at the Walker Ranch carrying news that would transform both the immediate situation and the long-term prospects for Jerome and Isabel's future in Colorado Territory. Catherine Wells was a middle-aged woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the kind of practical clothing that suggested familiarity with ranch life. She introduced herself as a representative of the Territorial Development Commission, a government agency responsible for promoting settlement and economic development in preparation for statehood. "I'm here because your situation has attracted attention in Denver," she explained, as they sat in Jerome's office, reviewing the documents she had brought. "The territorial government is concerned about communities that use intimidation and economic persecution to drive out productive citizens." "What kind of attention?" Isabel asked, uncertain whether government interest would prove helpful or create additional complications. "The kind that could affect federal support for infrastructure development and territorial services," Catherine replied. "Communities that can't maintain civil order and respect for property rights don't qualify for railroad subsidies, territorial road projects, or federal land grants for schools and public buildings." The implications were significant. Cedar Falls depended on territorial and federal support for many of the improvements that made frontier communities viable, and the loss of that support would seriously damage the town's economic prospects. "More specifically," Catherine continued, "I'm here to offer Mr. Walker a contract to supply beef cattle for the territorial government and federal agencies throughout the region. It's a substantial contract that would provide stable income and guarantee market access, regardless of local political considerations." Jerome studied the contract documents with growing amazement. The proposed agreement would purchase more cattle annually than his ranch currently produced, requiring him to expand his operations significantly and providing the kind of economic security that would make him largely independent of local business relationships. "There's one condition," Catherine added. "The contract specifically requires that your ranch operations meet territorial standards for fair employment practices and non-discrimination in hiring and business relationships. Any evidence of discriminatory practices would void the agreement." Isabel felt a moment of confusion before understanding the larger implications of the requirement. The territorial government was using its economic power to support businesses that demonstrated tolerance and inclusion, while discouraging communities that practiced discrimination and harassment. "This is very generous," Jerome said carefully. "May I ask why the territorial government is taking such interest in my particular situation?" Catherine smiled, the first time her serious demeanor had shown warmth. "Because Colorado needs successful ranchers who can supply reliable agricultural products as we work toward statehood. Because we need communities that welcome productive citizens regardless of their background. And because examples of tolerance and inclusion encourage the kind of diverse settlement that makes territories into thriving states." The contract. Negotiations took several days, during which Catherine stayed at the Walker Ranch and observed the operations firsthand. Her conversations with Jerome's hired hands revealed a workforce that included men of various ethnic backgrounds, united by competence and mutual respect, rather than divided by the social hierarchies that dominated many frontier communities. Your ranch demonstrates exactly the kind of environment we want to encourage throughout the territory, Catherine told Jerome as they finalized the agreement. Productive, inclusive, focused on results rather than ancestry or social position. But the most significant development came when Catherine made an unexpected proposal that would fundamentally change Isabel's situation and future prospects. "Miss Martinez," she said during their final evening at the ranch, "I've been observing your work here, and I'm impressed by your administrative skills and business knowledge. The Territorial Development Commission is looking for field representatives who can assess ranch operations and help coordinate government contracts throughout the region. Would you be interested in such a position?" Isabel felt as though the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. A government position would provide economic independence, professional recognition, and the kind of social status that would protect her from the harassment she had faced as Jerome's employee. The position would involve traveling throughout the territory, evaluating ranching operations, and helping coordinate supply contracts with territorial and federal agencies, Catherine continued. "It requires someone with extensive knowledge of ranch management, excellent administrative skills, and the ability to work effectively with people from diverse backgrounds." "It sounds like an extraordinary opportunity," Isabel replied carefully. "May I ask what prompted you to consider me for such a position?" Catherine's expression grew serious. "Because the territorial government needs representatives who understand both the challenges and the potential of frontier communities. Because your experience with discrimination gives you insights that help identify businesses and communities that practice fair treatment versus those that don't. And because your work here demonstrates exactly the kind of competence and character we need in territorial representatives." The offer represented everything Isabel had hoped for when she left California. Meaningful work, financial security, and the respect that came from professional accomplishment rather than social connections. But accepting it would mean leaving the Walker Ranch and the partnership she had built with Jerome, the first person to see her skills and potential rather than her heritage and circumstances. "I'm honored by the offer," Isabel said finally. "May I have some time to consider it?" "Of course. Take whatever time you need to make your decision." That night, Isabel sat in her quarters contemplating a choice that would determine not just her immediate future, but the direction of her entire life. The territorial position offered security and advancement beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. But it would also mean abandoning the quiet partnership she had built with Jerome, the daily satisfaction of managing ranch operations, and the peaceful life she had finally found after years of searching. Jerome knocked on her door as she was, struggling with these considerations, his expression showing that he understood the magnitude of the decision she was facing. "Catherine's offer is an incredible opportunity," he said, as they walked through the ranch yard under a canopy of brilliant stars. "The kind of position that could establish your career and provide financial security for the rest of your life." "It is," Isabel agreed. "I never imagined such possibilities would be available to someone with my background." They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, both recognizing that their conversation was approaching territory that went beyond professional considerations into something more personal and complex. "Isabel," Jerome said finally, "I need to tell you something that might affect your decision about Catherine's offer." Isabel felt her heart begin to race, uncertain what revelation might complicate an already difficult choice. "When I offered you employment here, it was because I needed administrative help, and you had the skills to provide it," Jerome continued. "But over these past months, Working together and facing the challenges from Carter's committee, I've come to realize that what I really need isn't just an employee. The implications of his words hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful but fragile. Isabel found herself afraid to speak, unwilling to risk misunderstanding something that might fundamentally change everything between them. "What I mean," Jerome said, stopping and turning to face her directly, "is that I've fallen in love with you. Not just with your competence and courage, though those qualities are remarkable. With you as a person, with the life we've built together, here, with the possibility of building something even more meaningful together." Isabel felt tears forming in her eyes, though whether from joy or sorrow she couldn't immediately determine. "Jerome, I know the territorial position represents everything you've worked toward," he continued quickly. "I know it would be selfish of me to ask you to give up such an opportunity, but I had to tell you how I feel before you make your decision." "And what are you asking me to choose?" Jerome took her hands in his dark eyes reflecting starlight and something deeper that made her breath catch. "I'm asking you to marry me, to stay here and build a life together, not as employer and employee, but as equal partners in everything we do, to help me expand the ranch into something that could support a family and demonstrate that people like us can create something lasting and valuable despite the obstacles others try to place in our path." The proposal was everything Isabel had secretly hoped for, but never dared to expect. Marriage to Jerome would provide not just love and companionship, but the kind of equal partnership she had dreamed of since childhood. Together, they could build something meaningful that honored both their backgrounds, while creating new possibilities for their children and community. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying all the hope and determination and love that had sustained her through the long journey from California to this moment under the Colorado stars. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in the ranch house parlor, with Sheriff Brooks serving as witness and Catherine Wells delaying her return to Denver to attend the ceremony. The guest list was small but significant, including Jerome's. Ranch hands, Martha Henderson from the dry goods store, and several neighboring ranchers who had supported them throughout the conflict with Carter's committee. Samuel Carter and his remaining supporters stayed away, but their absence only emphasized how isolated their position had become, as the community gradually recognized that tolerance and inclusion were more valuable than narrow-minded exclusion. The territorial contract proved as beneficial as Catherine had promised, providing the Walker Ranch with stable income and expansion opportunities that made it one of the most successful operations in the region. Isabel's administrative skills and Jerome's practical knowledge created a partnership that maximized both the efficiency of their operations and the satisfaction of their personal relationship. More importantly, their success demonstrated to other mixed heritage families and individuals that it was possible to build meaningful lives in frontier communities despite the prejudices and obstacles that still existed. Their ranch became an informal gathering place for people who didn't fit easily into established social categories, a demonstration that competence and character could triumph over ancestry and circumstances. 5 years later, as Isabel watched her 2 young children playing in the ranch yard, while Jerome worked with his expanding herd of cattle, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from rejection and despair to love and fulfillment. The mail-order bride, who had been rejected for her cursed blood, had found a man who saw that heritage as a blessing, a source of strength and resilience that enhanced everything they built together. Cedar Falls had evolved as well, gradually becoming the kind of community that valued diversity and inclusion over rigid social hierarchies. Samuel Carter had eventually left for opportunities elsewhere, his influence diminished by the failure of his persecution campaign. The territorial contract and the ranch's success had demonstrated the economic benefits of tolerance, while the Walker family's integration into community life had shown that cooperation was more valuable than conflict. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Isabel gathered her children and walked toward the house, where Jerome was waiting with dinner and the kind of quiet conversation that marked the end of productive days and the beginning of peaceful evenings. The woman who had arrived in Colorado Territory with nothing but hope and determination had found not just employment and security, but the deeper satisfaction of building a life based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that love could transcend any boundaries created by narrow minds and prejudiced hearts. Sometimes the greatest transformations began with the courage to see blessings where others saw curses, and possibilities where others saw only problems. Isabel Martinez Walker had learned that lesson well, and in learning it had helped transform not just her own life, but the entire community that had once rejected her and eventually learned to embrace the strength she brought to their shared future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.